Hello Girl Scouts, I'm Jeanine. We're doing a little hike-along video here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about forest ecology and forest fire, the results of forest fires. So we are in Upper Pajarito Canyon in Los Alamos. I'll give you a look around. You can see this is an old burn scar. This is from the Las Conchas fire, which happened about 9 years ago. Most of the canyon sides are pretty rocky and hot now in the summer, but you can see we're standing in a little aspen grove. One of the first plants to recolonize after a fire at higher elevations is aspens. This is because they send deep roots and they come up, they'll colonize in from the edges, or depending on how hot the fire was, maybe it didn't kill the roots underneath. Aspens grow fast. They love the sunlight, so they're quick recolonizers. These aspens actually surprised me because we're a little bit low in elevation, but you can see that we're at the bottom of a canyon. Here's one side. We're going to look past the thicket here. You can see the other side of the canyon. The bottom of a canyon often has an example of what's called inversion, meaning that it's cooler because cool air sinks. It's often cooler in the very bottom of the canyon. So that's probably why these aspens are here. You can also see in this rocky area, we have some of our common recolonizers. This is this fuzzy thing right here. This is a mullein plant. Now this, it's fuzzy and soft, and it eventually puts up stalks like this. These are mulleins from a few years ago. They can get very tall, like taller, over 6 feet. They are an invasive species, unfortunately, but they love to colonize disturbed areas, so they're a very common thing to find post-fire. We can also see, here's a promising sign of new growth. This is a little tiny ponderosa. It is just perhaps a little over a foot tall, so I'm guessing it's a few years old. Ponderosas grow very slowly, but it's a very promising sign. This all used to be a big ponderosa forest. We're seeing a few of those ponderosas coming back now that we're 9 years later. The other main plants I want you to notice are, and we're going to go back into the shade for this one. There's a couple. This is a gamble oak, another common recolonizer. It's got those very notched oak leaves. This is actually a small guy because there's this big tree, and I'm not exactly sure what this one is. But usually it's the gamble oaks that get that tall. They grow in profusion in sunny areas, so you see them recolonizing after forest fires. And this here is a wild rose. You can see this one's blooming. It's early June, so this is the time when roses bloom. We had kind of a warm and dry spring, so the roses are blooming fairly early. You can see the wild rose typified by the 5 petals, the kind of oval notched leaves, and then they are thorny. A little hard to see the thorns, but if I get you up close, you might see the thorns on the thick stalks there. These are called the canes. They're called canes. And I've actually seen some of last season's rose hips, but I don't see any on these wild roses right here. A rose hip is after the rose dies. It's leaving here. The petals have all fallen off. And it'll form a round fruit that's red, usually red or orange. It's called a rose hip. It's a favorite food of bears. These are kind of classic wild roses. You can see they're a light pink. You will also sometimes see them in white or yellow. That's very unusual. You can also see them in a darker pink or red. So this is our native forest ecology, our colonizers post-fire. Right, we are a little further along the trail here, and we've dropped into what is clearly a very narrow part of the canyon. And you can see that right here, the fire did not get down here. If you look way up at the top, you can still see some stumps that burned. You can look over here and see the same thing, but this part was deep enough that it didn't burn up. So this is what the whole canyon used to look like. And what you can see that's interesting here is that most of these big pine trees that we're looking at are actually fir trees, not ponderosas. Now, ponderosas are a much more common tree out here, and if you look up on the top, might be hard to tell in the video, but that's ponderosas up on top. But because of inversion, where normally you would have a ponderosa forest, down in the bottom of the canyon, we're looking at fir trees. So here's a young one, so we can look at what the difference is. You can see that a young fir tree has these little short needles and a whole bunch all over the whole branch instead of 3 needles and 3 long needles together like a ponderosa. You can see that the bark is a little smoother. It's kind of a gray brown instead of the kind of black and brown puzzle bark that a ponderosa has. I don't see any pine cones right here, but oh, here we are. Okay, if you look at these pine cones, you can see that a ponderosa, this is a longer cone, narrower. A ponderosa has a wide, kind of fatter cone to it. I don't know exactly what kind of fir tree these are, unfortunately, but they are fir trees, not ponderosas, and they usually grow at higher altitudes. Another thing we might see, we have an open spot here where some of the trees either burned or broke off. And so we can see some of our successors. We've got a ganvel oak over here. We've got some mullein down here. This is a native, I believe it might be barberry or elderberry, but it's also a native shrub. It likes to be down here where there's a lot of water. Here, we've got kind of an interesting little plant. We've got 2 here actually. Here's another thorny New Mexico native. This guy, they usually get much bigger. I'll show you a bigger one later if I can find one. You can see the sharp thorns. This is a New Mexico locust. And right now they're blooming in a lot of places. They have these nice oval-shaped leaves, dark brown stems covered in thorns. They have a beautiful clusters of pink and purple blossoms. This one right here, this is a maidenhair fern. Well, this is kind of interesting, and this guy really likes water. So you can hear in the background probably the creek. If I turn, you can see it. We got a creek running down in the bottom of the canyon here, and so we have maidenhair ferns growing along the sides. You really only see this in the bottom of canyons where it's wet. Right here, we have another little fun plant. This is yarrow. It's got this it's short, low to the ground. It's got these real fuzzy leaves. These were used medicinally to stop bleeding. They are astringent. And right next to those guys, also real small on the ground here, we've got strawberries. You can see their classic 3-leaf structure with the notches on the leaves. They are dark green, but they're not the dark shiny green that you would expect from a poison oak or a poison ivy, right? And you can also, if you look down at their base, you can often see the runners connecting the different plants. Now, this is not a very well-developed colony. It doesn't look like, so you can't see the runners. But if you see a big patch of strawberries, you'll often see runners. So that's little stems connecting the 2 plants because that's how they spread. We've got a little bit of a little white flower here. I believe this is a fleabane. So you can see it's small, looks like a little tiny daisy. They're a little pinkish or purplish on the edges. And they've got very narrow leaves. When we're identifying plants like this, we're looking for a couple of different things. We're looking for color. We're looking for shape and size. So, we look at this fleabane. Shape, they tend to be kind of tall and thin. Color, it's got a white blossom, maybe a little edging into pink or purple on the very edges. It's hard to see on the video. And then size, fleabanes are small. So here's my hand, right? We're down here way low to the ground. Those are the things we look for. And then we also want to think about our ecosystem, right? We identified the maidenhair fern, and here's more of it. It's usually a smaller plant, but it can get up to knee high, and it's got these kind of round, kind of lobed leaves. Tends to be a light green. But we also want, when we're trying to identify it, we want to think, are we near water? If we're near water, we may identify a maidenhair fern. So here's some other ones over here. I apparently have a pleasing fungus beetle on me. The pleasing fungus beetle loves... Where?
I can show it.
All right. I'm going to get a look at my pleasing fungus beetle friend.
There.
There it is. So you can see it's blue and speckled. That's why it's called a pleasing fungus beetle. It's very pretty.
Yes.
They nest in, or they pupate in fallen trees, like these, and then eat the fungus that grows on them. So of course, in areas where there have been forest fires and you have a lot of downed trees, you get a lot of pleasing fungus beetles. All right, we're gonna hike up a little further and see if I can find you some other.
I think your pleasing fungus beetle.
I'm gonna find you some other spiky New Mexico natives. All right, here we are. I found some taller New Mexico locusts to give you an idea of how big they usually get. This is a New Mexico locust, and in fact, this whole hillside is covered in them. I'll try to get a close-up on some of those flowers in a minute, but I actually stopped here because we've got a little flower here called a cranesbill, also called a wild geranium. So you can see, here's the flower. It's got 5 petals. They're usually white or purple, and they have little stripes on them. They've got a very sawtoothed leaf here. They grow pretty low to the ground. You can see where, here's the ground, here's my hand and the log. So they're not very tall. And they're called a cranesbill because when they go to seed, their seed pod forms a long, thin shape like the bill of a bird, a crane. So that's cranesbill. That's a common one. We're just starting to see it flower. It's a summer blossom in New Mexico. We're going to go around this tree and up a little further because I think I can show you. Oh, here we go. Here's another thorny New Mexico native that likes to grow in these parts. This is a raspberry bush, or raspberry canes as they're properly called. You can see there are fuzzy thorns all over them. These ones are about to set fruit. So you can see that's the fruit that's starting up. So they have a white blossom, and then they set a fruit, and we're a little early in the summer for fruit from these guys. This is a late summer fruit, but we have another little beauty here. Oh, look at this. I'm surprised. This is another example of inversion. This is a violet, a wild violet. Now in New Mexico, these are often white, although I did see some purple ones on the Cañada Bonita Trail. You can see it also has 5 petals, but it's got a rounded petal at the bottom and then long kind of lobed petals on the top, 2 on the top and 2 on the sides. It has a heart-shaped leaf. They grow very low to the ground. They like water. So you usually find them higher in elevation than this, like up in the mountains. Rancho and Barker are both good places to find violets. They tend to be a late, well, they're a spring flower, but of course, the higher you get in elevation, the later the spring happens. So, you know, we're talking May, early June, late May, early June, depending on how warm your spring was. And usually you just find a few at a time tucked away in places. They're very pretty. When I lived in Indiana, you would see whole hillsides of them, but they're more rare in New Mexico now. I'm going to get you a little closer. You can see the blossoms on that New Mexico locust. We're at arm's length, so this locust is a good 12 feet tall, probably. But you can see the clusters of pink blossoms all over this one. Get a little further up. You have penguins on your backpack, that's it. Here we've got our thorny New Mexico locusts again, and our thorny native berries. It's a very thorny trail.
Yes. Quite thorny.
Going along, we can see some more roses here. We've got a gamble oak, another gamble oak. You can see this gamble oak is quite a lot taller than me. That's a much more normal size for a gamble oak. See if I can get you any closer. We're not seeing very many of these locusts up close, unfortunately. We'll try to find some later, but you can see, just as we turn here, all of that is New Mexico locust. So it gets pretty big normally, and has a really pretty pink blossom on it. All right. Okay, I finally found some New Mexico locusts that are blooming. So you can see this is all New Mexico locusts in here, with the one big mullen in the middle. And here we've got some of the flowers. You can see they're really kind of delicate pink. They have, I believe that New Mexico locust is a pea plant, so you can see that distinctive shape on each blossom, right, where it's sort of enclosed, a little bit of tongue hanging out. They come in clusters. And we've got another set of them over here, blooming. They're very pretty. They've been blooming like nobody's business this year. can also see we've got a rose bush here, and you can see some old rose hips. That little spot of red there is an old rose hip from last season the bears didn't get. When a New Mexico locust forms a seed pod, of course we're way too early for seed pods here. You can see some of these aren't even blooming. But it makes like a bean pod or a pea pod. So they're in the pea family in some way. So here we've got, you can see we're back into a burned area. A little stump of a tree. You can see it's afternoon. We got the monsoon storm coming up behind us. So we are going to hurry back to the car. Thanks, Girl Scouts. Bye. Okay, I couldn't help myself. We got one more video because look at this big patch of ferns. You don't normally see these, but of course we are right next to the stream here. And if you look on the other side, I don't know that I can zoom in here. What we can see are bluebells right over there. Sorry, they're pretty fuzzy, but you can see they grow in a kind of a bushy plant. Ooh, we got a bee in one of them, and they have these little hanging blue and sometimes pink bell-shaped flowers. You usually find them at higher elevations, but you also always find them along streams. They love water. I believe we've got some buttercups down here. These might actually be some kind of avens, is what a buttercup usually is. They're taller than I usually see them, but they're yellow. They've got five petals. But just a real unusual, got a kind of unusual fern, that green ferny bit that's all sticking up like this. I'm not sure what that is, but it looks a little bit like a horsetail fern, which is an old throwback, a very old plant. Anyway, you can see we've got aspens, we've got some very large shrubs that I don't know how to identify. And more fallen logs, so therefore more fungus beetles.